Okay, g'day everyone, my name's Timothy, and for only a brief moment, hopefully, I'm going to be grinding out some materials just to make some equipment. One I've got my eyes on is the Lunagoron Frost Jewel. Okay, g'day everyone, my name's Timothy. Well, at least my voice is coming through. Good to know. Also, my current weapon is this, because I like the purple on it, and it's a good blast upgrade. And you might also notice my arm is a bit different. While I've got, the dignified for whenever I want to use a switch axe, I also took notice of this one, Channeler. It seems like a good, thing to use whenever I don't want to use a switch axe, such as, Sword and Shield. Unfortunately, the slots leave a lot to be desired, because I can't get. I got 5 evade windows. That's good. I just don't have enough room for, jumping. I can't jump. And also, unfortunately, these. The talismans, I don't really have anything that has a good evade extender. Like there's there's that one there, but, well, yeah. I would need a 4 slot if I want to get it maxed out. I suppose I could be happy with just the the 2 in level 2 evade extender. What's the other one that I was using? Ah, great, I forgot what I was using. What was it? Where was it? There, that one. Counter-strike and fortify. Yeah, counter-strike and fortify. Because at the very least, see if my evade doesn't, if I can't dodge an attack from evading, I'm at least gonna get a plentiful attack bonus from it. Let's see, look at it. Plus 25 attack whenever I get knocked on my ass. And, considering, evade window is good, but if I can't, there's been many of times where I can't actually roll out of the way of an attack, so, at the very least I get this bonus. And also fortify, so whenever I actually die, hey, at least I got a little bit more bonus to it. Anywho. Alright, I did, because I'm hunting Lunagorons, so I talked to this bloke here. Well, not talk, but I did his, hunt, so, whoa, you really got gnarly up there on those kingdom monsters, Ace. And your skills have improved so much. No matter how much you improve, a hunter's drain is never done, don't forget that. And although it wasn't planned, Elder Fugan made the right move sending you off into action. The peeps you meet and our monsters you take on will guide you even greater heights, and I can't wait to see it. The Royal Order's home. Why do you give me that weapon? You, on the hunt, use dual blades. Oh, Ace, how's my favorite pupil? Well, I hope you're doing well, because it's that time again. What time is it? Time to thrash. And if we thrash together, the quest will be done in half the time. Hey, the monster to be double thrashed. Either way, the quest is already set up and ready to go. So when you're ready to thrash, let's thrash. Really? Bloody... We go from one bloody... Oh, alright. There's a blue somewhere here. Who... that is blue wants to talk to me. You! Oh, you got a Lunagoron. Oh yeah, I caught it. So, did Joe and Baxton as well. That's great. One thing, blah blah blah. I talked to Smithy, blah blah blah, some full switch axe, and blah 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 blah. Anyway, blah 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 blah. Oh, I'll never get to visit my wife and daughter if I don't get... And that's a death flag if I ever heard one. Don't say that. You know what? No. I said I'll never get to see them. It's can't wait to see them. That's death flag. You. Oh, not you. You. Oh my god. Why does it have to do that every time? Anyway, was it? Oh, it was that. The Blossom Fall. I was reading these. None of these have, you know, Blossom Fall to it. No, it was the origami one. And once again, only if you had purple sharpness, then you would have been worth it. But you don't. Always too late. It's always it's the weapon I want to use, but so I made this. Kind of beat one off, you know, while I was off listening to another thing, but it looks pretty good. Good purple. Also considering making this one as well, so I suppose that means I'll just have to. But then again, I'll have to, you know, break its wings, and unfortunately, can't really break its wings with sword and shield. I mean, I'll have to use switch over the switch axe, but neither here or there. As of right now, I've got a Lunagron to fight. Again and again and again and again and again and again. I'll stun. I've got so many of these, dude. There's that. There's these. That. I suppose I could do this one. So many things I don't want to do. Hello, Minoto. I gotta do Tigrex one as well. You know what? No, I'll do the Tigrex one and come back to the Lunagron one afterwards, because then I'll have the two sisters fight hunting with me. Alright, that sounds like a plan. Tigrex. Not gonna find it here. Tigrex. Thunder. Alright, if I'm having too much trouble with this, then just I'll switch on over to Thunder. In the meantime. Right, I already looked through all this. Oh right, as well. I meant to switch you lot over to change gear. What have you? You got that. Need you to be Thunder. And might as well just leave you here. With you, Poison. Power. No, baby, no. Alright, I'll leave it on Poison. Next up, time to eat something, and then... Oh, right, I got distracted, as I was meant to be listening to... What's this? Boost attack. When a monster attacks you during an emergency evade. Emergency evade? I don't know. Oh, emergency evade when I get knocked on my ass and I use the, you know, the thingy to try to dodge. Maybe. Oh well. I'm more of this one. Perilous Specialist Defender Medic. Alright. on, hurry up and load. Oh, what's this map? Oh, I hate this map. And I forgot to move my bloody Raycon one again. Oh well. Oh, also forgot to turn these down. 40, 35, 35, 40, 40, 30, 40. Alright. Now, to listen to that video I was going to watch. No, not that one. This one. The Hoboken Docks Fire. Interesting. By Fascinating Horror. That's right. I'm listening to Fascinating Horror this time.
On the 30th of June, 1900, a small fire began in a stack of cotton bales on a wharf at the Hoboken docks in New Jersey. Over the next few minutes, this tiny blaze would spread and grow, edging steadily closer to a nearby store of oil and turpentine. One of the worst disasters the area had ever seen was about to take place, a disaster that would cost hundreds of people their lives. Hoboken is a city in the US state of New Jersey. Situated on the Hudson waterfront, it is a vital port and transit hub, and has been for over 100 years. In the late 1800s, the Hoboken docks were a busy area. As well as being the terminus of several railway lines, they were also the site of many wharfs and piers, owned and operated by different companies. Ships would deliver and pick up huge quantities of cargo and large numbers of passengers on a daily basis. One company to have facilities at the Hoboken docks was Norddeutsche Lloyd, or NDL, a German shipping company founded in 1857, which by 1900 was one of the largest shipping companies in the world. It both delivered cargo and transported passengers to and from Hoboken on transatlantic voyages. It owned and operated many piers and warehouses in the area, and at any given time there were likely to be several NDL ships moored in the area. The original source of the fire that began on the 30th of June 1900 is unknown. Flames were first noticed around 4 p.m. in a single bale of cotton near Pier Number 3, the southernmost of the piers owned by NDL. It is possible that the bale had been smouldering unnoticed for some time. Whatever started the fire, it could not be extinguished. A strong breeze that was blowing at the time provided oxygen for the blaze and spread it quickly to other bales of cotton stacked on the wharf, and then to other cargo. Stored nearby were hundreds of barrels of oil and turpentine. The fire quickly engulfed these, and the barrels began to explode. The buildings which lined the dock were mostly of timber construction. These were soon ablaze as well, as was the mostly wooden pier. Within just 15 minutes, the flames had spread to engulf an area of the docks 400 meters, or a quarter of a mile, long. The rapid spread of the flames stranded hundreds of people on the piers. Many were dock workers, but there were also dozens of visitors and merchants. With escape by land impossible, and the wooden piers beginning to burn, they took the only way out available to them. They jumped into the water. At this time and place in history, many people, even those who worked on or around ships, could not swim. Many of those who jumped drowned, while others clung to the stanchions of the pier only to suffocate as the fire consumed the wooden decking above them. The ships moored at the burning piers were in danger of catching fire too. It would take hours to prepare their engines, and so they could not simply move away from the fire under their own steam. One ocean liner, the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, was quickly pulled away from the conflagration by 2 tugboats, and thus survived the blaze. Though she was left with a massive scorch mark on the side of her hull, nobody on board lost their life, and the ship was able to sail as scheduled just a few days later. Other ships moored at the Hoboken docks did not fare so well. The Saal, the Maine, and the Bremen all caught fire. Their mooring lines were cut, and they drifted out into the river. The fire on board the Saal left as many as 100 people trapped below decks. As firefighting boats hosed down the deck, some were able to emerge from shelter and jump overboard, but others remained trapped by the flames, waving frantically for help through portholes that were too small for them to climb through. One fireboat was able to feed a hose through a porthole to the people trapped within, but this was insufficient to tackle the fire, and these people did not survive. When the Saal looked as though she might drift towards some piers on the other side of the river, she was towed towards Ellis Island, where she sank with significant loss of life. The Bremen had around 200 people on board when its mooring lines were cut. Every passenger and crew member subsequently left the vessel at some point, almost all of them by jumping overboard to take their chances in the water. The burning ship crossed the river and bumped against a pier on the New York side, almost setting it ablaze. Fortunately, firefighters were standing ready to extinguish the fire before it could take hold. Eventually, the Bremen was towed to the Weehawken Flats, where it was grounded and gutted by the fire. The Maine was also towed to the Weehawken Flats, and there grounded. Firefighters worked tirelessly to extinguish the flames and eventually did so after almost 7 hours. 16 survivors were found on board, all of them coal passers who had taken refuge inside a coal bunker when the fire began. After enduring oven-like temperatures for such a long period of time, one had lost his sight, and the others were extremely distressed, but all survived. While tugs and fireboats on the water worked to extinguish the burning ships, firefighters on land struggled to fight the flames on the burning piers. The blaze was simply too intense to extinguish, and so they resorted to containing the fire and allowing it to burn out, which it eventually did. As well as moving ships, tugboats pulled many people from the water. Crowds gathered on the shoreline to watch and threw lines to anyone who was able to swim close enough to be rescued. Despite these efforts, many of the people who entered the water did not survive. In total, at least 326 people were killed in this disaster. The recovery of bodies from the Hudson River over the next few days and weeks was a difficult process. While some were pulled from the water on the day of the fire, others were found inside the gutted ships as they were drained. In an attempt to dislodge further bodies that might be stuck on the bed of the Hudson, dynamite was used, but this did not cause any further bodies to rise to the surface. An investigation in the aftermath of the fire was unable to establish a cause for the blaze. It was put down to carelessness, with some possible causes being a dropped match or a stray spark landing in the cotton during transit and smouldering away for hours or days before being fanned into a full-blown fire by the wind. Whatever the cause, it was recognized that the disaster could not be allowed to happen again. When the piers were rebuilt, they were constructed from steel and other less flammable materials. The design of many ships was also changed. The scenes of trapped people wavering from portholes on board the Saal had been deeply shocking, and it was decided that portholes on passenger boats should be at least large enough for most people to clamber through in an emergency. There was also some criticism of the actions of the tugboat captains during the fire. A German inquiry accused tugboat captains of being uncooperative, and argued that more lives could have been saved if the crews of the tugboats had focused on retrieving people from the water rather than attempting to salvage the ships. Despite this, there were no serious legal consequences. A mass funeral was held on the 4th of July, during which all bodies which could not be identified were buried in a mass grave at a plot in Flower Hill Cemetery paid for by NDL. A granite marker was installed the next year, bearing the names of those who had lost their lives in the fire. The gutted ocean liners were refloated and rebuilt, and continued to sail for many years before finally being lost or decommissioned. The Hoboken docks fire of 1900 was not the last fire to strike the docks that line the Hudson River, but it was the most deadly. Thanks in part to changes made in the aftermath of this fire, subsequent dock fires have been only a fraction as dangerous and a fraction as deadly. On the 8th of May 1979, a taxi driver in Manchester, England radioed his dispatcher to say that he could see smoke billowing from a Woolworths supermarket in the middle of the city. This information was quickly passed on to the fire brigade, who sped to the scene, arriving in just under 2 minutes. Despite this lightning-fast response, the fire that followed would be one of the deadliest that Manchester had seen since the end of World War II, and would go down in history as a terrible and unnecessary waste of human life. Woolworths in the UK was founded by businessman Frank Woolworth in 1909. He'd already made a career out of setting up five and dime stores in the United States under the auspices of the F.W. Woolworth Company, and in doing so had revolutionised retail in a number of ways. For example, he did away with haggling in favour of fixed prices for merchandise, and put his stock on display in self-service display cabinets, so that shoppers could take a look at items without having to speak to a sales clerk. Both of these now commonplace practices were revolutionary at the time, and helped catapult Frank Woolworth to success as a retail magnate. Having conquered the States, he was keen to expand his empire to the UK, and he took the first step towards doing just that in November of 1909, when the first Woolworths variety store opened in Liverpool. It did so with a significant amount of fanfare. The opening was celebrated with a full orchestra, circus acts, and a spectacular fireworks display. From these not-so-humble origins, Woolworths expanded rapidly. Branches opened across the UK, with the company's growth pausing only briefly during the years of World War I and World War II. As decades passed, Woolworths rapidly became a household name. It was known for stocking an eclectic range of goods. In the average store, you could purchase everything from furniture to flatware, along with music, books, toys, and, from the 1980s onwards, a bag of candy from their extensive range of pick-and-mix. Many outlets also had cafes, where shoppers could rest and get a bite to eat. The Manchester store was a fairly typical Woolworths. It was situated in a prime location within Manchester, occupying 6 floors inside a grand old building that had once upon a time been a bonded warehouse. The fire began in the furniture department, and was later traced to a faulty electrical cable, which ignited polyurethane foam furniture that had been stacked for storage. Polyurethane was, at the time, a brand new material. Given that it was cheap and durable, its use was widespread, but unfortunately it wasn't realised just how dangerous it could be. Polyurethane foam could be toxic, and was also highly flammable, producing thick, extremely poisonous smoke when burned. It was this thick, black, toxic smoke which now spread throughout the store. The sight of it sent shoppers and staff running for the exits. But in areas where the smoke wasn't visible, the evacuation was slow to start. Some shoppers later recalled seeing gangs of people running frantically for the exits, but assumed that these were unruly football fans, and thought nothing further of it until they saw or smelled the smoke themselves. Catherine McGuinn, who survived the incident, was dining in the cafe with her daughter when the fire began, and recalls the event. My daughter said, "Mum, I've just heard someone shout fire." I said, "Don't be silly. You could look straight down the floor. There was no smoke, no fire, no nothing." We carried on eating. Then, about 5 minutes later, a girl shouted very, very loudly, "Fire, get out." I said, "Someone will get a fire extinguisher and put it out. It's only a little one." After some further encouragement from her daughter, Catherine McGuinn made the fortunate decision to leave the store. We were down about 4 steps and my daughter said, "Come back a bit while I show you something." I went back up with her and, oh my lord, we looked towards the furniture department and moving along the ceiling was the most terrible black smoke, just rolling along the ceiling. It was horrible, and it was coming towards the people who were sat down. I couldn't do anything about it. I saw that those people were going to die. Alarms did eventually sound throughout the store, but these were not heard on the floors above the main retail space, where staff members were working in offices and stockrooms. These workers found themselves trapped by smoke before they had any chance to escape. Worse still, the windows on these floors were blocked by iron bars, a legacy from when the building had been a bonded warehouse. Even though firefighters arrived on scene almost instantly and could reach the floors where staff members were trapped with extendable ladders, they had to wait for specialist equipment to cut the bars before they could get them out. Some customers were unable to find an exit in the thick black smoke, a task made especially difficult as several emergency exits were locked to prevent shoplifting. With nowhere else to go, they fled to the roof, from which firefighters were able to evacuate them using cherry pickers. This was a painfully slow process, as there was space for only 5 at a time in the basket of each cherry picker. Fearing that they would not be rescued in time, a significant number of people on the roof re-entered the building and tried to find an alternate way out. One firefighter was shocked to see the crowd awaiting rescue dwindle each time he went back up to the roof. Having at first seen around 50 people waiting there, he eventually was only able to retrieve 13, with the remainder fleeing back into the store, despite his assurances that the fire would not break through to the roof. Despite an intense rescue effort, by the time the flames were extinguished around 2 hours later, 10 people had lost their lives. Among the dead were 31-year-old Michael Archer, 68-year-old Sarah Jane Bird, 86-year-old Dorothy Botham, 69-year-old Helena Gunn, 29-year-old Hazel Ann Heaton, 32-year-old Susan Heaton, 70-year-old Albert Edward McNally, 73-year-old Ernest Naylor, and 59-year-old Patricia Jean Simmons. 68-year-old Cyril Baldwin, a Woolworths staff member who had been an auxiliary fireman during the Second World War, also died whilst helping customers escape. In the aftermath of the disaster, an investigation was launched. The issues it uncovered were numerous. The store had no sprinkler system despite its size. The fire alarm did not sound in every area of the building. Staff had not been trained on the procedure for calling the fire brigade. Some emergency doors had to be opened using a key from a break glass box beside the door, even though this type of fire exit had been found to be deadly in other recent building fires. Still other exits were completely locked with no key available at all, ostensibly as a measure against shoplifting. These issues were surprising, given that this was not the first time a Woolworths store had caught fire. In 1973, a fire had ripped through a store in Colchester. The absence of a sprinkler system allowed the fire to spread rapidly, and it was noted that several customers refused to evacuate until they had finished meals or drinks they had paid for. Both these issues foreshadowed what would happen in Manchester 6 years later. Instead of learning from this earlier fire, though, Woolworths management had instead opted to focus on rebuilding and reopening the Colchester store as soon as possible. They received an insurance payout that amply covered the damage done, and were able to relocate the gutted store to a bigger and more modern building. The Colchester fire could have been a wake-up call. Instead, it was treated as little more than an inconvenience. A potential opportunity to avert the devastating Manchester fire was missed. Coverage of the Manchester fire was extensive, and it did lead to some positive changes in regulation. One major factor in the fire was the abundance of polyurethane furniture inside the store. The flammability of this material and the thick, poisonous smoke it produced made the fire significantly more deadly. Following the fire, a campaign to require furniture makers to use fire-resistant materials was launched. It took 9 years of hard work and dedication on the part of many different people to persuade the government of the need for change. But in 1988, the Furniture and Furnishings Fire Safety Regulations Act came into force. The use of more fireproof materials in furniture has, over the course of many years, no doubt saved hundreds of lives. On top of this, the furore which followed the fire led to a change in leadership at Woolworths. Under new ownership, stores across the country installed state-of-the-art sprinkler systems and retrained staff in how to respond to emergencies. Woolworths also made some notable additions to its already eclectic range. For as long as the chain remained in business, domestic smoke alarms were sold in almost every branch of Woolworths across the country, with management working hard to both promote the use of and drive down the cost of these life-saving devices.
Anyway, what we just listened to was the 1979 Woolworths Fire, a short documentary by Fascinating Horror. As I was doing last time, every time I listen to one of these, I will update my description with the title of the video and the link to said video. Big scratch. Come on. 5, 6. The Hunter Point disaster. Alright, that's got my interest. Ah, no, that's Maritime Horrors. I'll be back for you the next time. Alright, Fascinating Horror. Let's see, what else is there? Nope, I don't want to listen to the Burden Park disaster because most likely it's gonna be about a crush. You know what a crush is? It's basically when the crowd of people literally, squeeze into each other and start crushing. As an example, if the whole bunch of people try to escape through one small corridor, there's bound to be, people squishing up against each other, and since there's so many people trying to push their way through the narrow corridor, people are inevitably going to get crushed. Like, if they fall down, they're not getting up, they're going to get trampled on by the people. Hell, there's even cases where people will die standing up. They get so squished by other people that they can't breathe and they will suffocate or they'll have a heart attack. And it's just awful. Crushes, out of all the disaster channels and all that, crushes genuinely make me kind of upset because they are completely preventable things. Like, at least the other disasters, there's some kind of, I don't want to say excuse, but something breaks, something's on fire, something explodes, it's the weather, this and that. But with crushes, there's no excuse. It's literally people squishing other people. Like, especially the worst cases are when there's like a kind of a, I wouldn't say riot, but I remember one case where they were trying, it was at a stadium, a football stadium or whatever, and the crowd got all rowdy and wanted to all charge into the field, but instead they were getting all caught up by the fence, and guess what? A crush happened against the fence. And people literally died up against the fence as they were being pushed by the people behind them, and so on and so forth. So, I just want to avoid those ones. They leave a bad taste in my mouth. Just, ugh. Because it's not like, damn disasters, we'll see, the bloody CEOs and all the top people, cutting corners and all that. No, they're literally everyday normal people that, I don't like them. What's this? The Mississauga Miracle, a short documentary.
On the 10th of November 1979, a freight train made up of numerous tankers containing hazardous materials derailed in Mississauga, Canada. A massive explosion was followed by a toxic gas leak, which threatened to spread towards nearby residential areas. The derailment would ultimately impact around 220,000 people from the local area. but in a miraculous turn of events would result in precisely 0 deaths. Mississauga is a city on the shores of Lake Ontario, adjacent to the state capital of Toronto. In the 1970s, it was home to around 250,000 people. It grew out of a number of townships and villages in the area, and its closeness to Toronto allowed it to flourish economically. It is a city with a thriving business sector, a diverse population, a strong community, and plenty of civic culture. On the evening of the 10th of November, a Canada Pacific freight train entered Mississauga, running eastbound from Windsor. It was pulled by 3 diesel-electric locomotives and consisted of 106 cars, many of which were tanker cars. These tankers carried a range of hazardous substances including styrene, propane, caustic soda, and chlorine. In charge of the train were 3 crew members. Conductor Ted Nicol was joined by brakeman Larry Krupa and engineer Keith Pruss. Pruss was, incidentally, Krupa's father-in-law, and the pair often worked together on the railway. All was well on board the train as they entered the city, but as the train passed through the centre of town, a wheel bearing began to overheat. It would later emerge that this was due to the failure of a system designed to lubricate the bearing. The lack of lubrication caused friction, which generated heat. As the train progressed, the bearing became hotter and hotter to the point that it was emitting sparks and glowing with heat. Eventually, this accumulated heat grew so great that it burned through the wheel axle, causing the entire wheel assembly to detach. It pinged off, flew through the air, and landed in the yard of a nearby home. The car it had come from, the 33rd out of 106 in the train, derailed just after passing a busy level crossing. The other cars piled into it, derailing and splaying across the tracks. Several cars burst open, spilling their contents, some of which was flammable. The accident caused an automatic braking system to bring the locomotives to an abrupt halt. Brakeman Larry Krupa and engineer Keith Pruss looked back along the line and watched as a massive fireball rose from their train, climbing to the height of a 40-story building. The men were aware that they were hauling dangerous cargo. They conferred and made a plan to move the undamaged cars away from the wreck to prevent the fire from spreading to them. To make this happen, Mr. Krupa ran back along the line towards the conflagration and manually unhooked a coupling. Mr. Pruss was then able to drive the remaining undamaged cars away to safety, quickly removing a huge quantity of flammable material from the area. At the same time, emergency services converged on the site. It was a disaster larger in scale than many firefighters had ever dealt with before, but none of them hesitated to tackle the blaze, even as several tankers detonated in secondary and tertiary explosions. Deputy Fire Chief Ross Kelly later said, "It was an incredible sight. The explosion was like 1,000 feet high by 1,000 feet wide. I will say this about the men, I am proud of them. There was no backing down off this fire, not once. Not one man shirked. When you asked someone to do something, he did it, regardless of the danger." As soon as conductor Ted Nicol notified firefighters that the tankers contained potentially deadly chlorine, an evacuation was ordered. Police cars patrolled nearby streets, waking up residents and alerting them to the danger using loudhailers. Foot patrols then followed, knocking on doors and ensuring that families evacuated promptly. This initially involved only the residents closest to the site, around 6,000 people. But this number quickly grew to 20,000 as further explosions lit up the night sky. The scale of the evacuation would increase several more times during the next 24 hours. Evacuees were initially taken to the Square One Mall. However, as the weather changed and wind increased, it was decided that they should be moved further away to the Sherway Gardens shopping centre, and then further away again to the International Trade Centre. At the same time, a much larger swathe of the city was also ordered to evacuate. By the end of the second day, firefighters were still working on the wreck. By now, almost the whole of Mississauga had been ordered to evacuate. The mayor, Hazel McCallion, told media that the city was closed until further notice, and advised residents that nobody aside from emergency workers should be found in the danger zone. By this time, just under 250,000 people had been evacuated, in an operation that was, at the time, the largest evacuation on American soil in peacetime. This was no small feat, and required a great deal of careful management to avoid casualties. Evacuees had been forced to flee, in some cases, without vital medication. So pharmacies were opened, and their stores used to fill emergency prescriptions. People were fed and provided with drinking water, clothes and blankets to keep them warm at night. The Red Cross was brought in to assist with the evacuation of nursing homes and hospitals, and many local residents in safe neighbouring areas allowed evacuees to stay in their homes to ease pressure on the emergency spaces available. Local historian Matthew Wilkinson was a child at the time and managed to sleep through most of the evacuation. His mother chose not to wake him, and instead simply carried him to a friend's house. Mr. Wilkinson later described his confusion at going to bed in his home in Mississauga and waking up at a friend's house in Oakville. Other residents described feeling as though war had started, a plane had crashed, or that their city had been subject to a nuclear attack. So massive was the explosion. At the same time, however, many also noted that the community was extremely supportive during the evacuation, with residents going out of their way to help one another throughout. Firefighters worked at the wreck site for several days. At one point, 8 firefighters were exposed to chlorine gas and were taken to hospital, but with treatment, all of them recovered. By the 3rd day, the flames had been extinguished, but the presence of chlorine still posed a significant danger. Over the next 3 days, as a few residents were allowed to return home, emergency workers successfully drained away the remaining chlorine and made safe the other materials on site. At last, after almost a week of intense effort, evacuated residents were allowed to return home. Throughout the entire process, the only injuries sustained by the civilian population had been relatively minor. The mayor of Mississauga sustained one of these minor injuries. While surveying the wreckage, she twisted her ankle and had to be helped into her next press conference. Despite her injury, she carried on working for 3 days without sleep, reassuring the population, responding to the media, and organising the return of evacuees. Following the disaster, she served out the rest of her term as mayor, and was then re-elected continuously until she retired when she was in her 90s. Throughout her career, she did not campaign and refused political donations, instead asking that her supporters donate to charity instead. Larry Krupa, the brakeman who had voluntarily run back towards the wreck site to uncouple the undamaged cars, was recommended for the Order of Canada Award for his bravery during the disaster. He was also inducted into the North America Railway Hall of Fame. Thanks to his intervention, the tireless work of the emergency services, and a calm and supportive population, the disaster and ensuing evacuation resulted in no deaths or critical injuries. This incredible statistic, by the way, also includes the animal population of the affected area. Residents who had to evacuate were unable to bring dogs, cats, or other pets with them. Over the 7 days during which they were absent, arrangements were made for the Ontario Humane Society to work with firefighters in the danger zone to feed and care for pets that had been left behind. The response to the disaster was so exceptional that it was used as a case study, informing the emergency plans of other similar cities across Canada. Now, many years later, the derailment is a vital part of the history of the town. Although it was a destructive, frightening and upsetting experience at the time, many residents now look back on it fondly as a time when their community was able to show its strength and unity.
It is the 9th of December 1946, and 23 men are led into courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany. This
Not right now. That's not good. Okay, some breathing room. Now, let's go to this, and let's choose another video. And fortunately, with Fascinating Horror, his videos is a bit more shorter. Just a bit more shorter. Mainly in the 10 minutes range. 9 minutes, 10 minutes, 11 minutes. This one looks interesting. Stockline plastics disaster. Copy. Paste.
On the 11th of May 2004, a huge explosion shattered the quiet of a hot spring day in the Maryhill district of Glasgow, Scotland. The blast had taken place on the premises of the Stockline plastics factory, almost completely destroying the facility's main building and trapping at least a dozen workers. It was a disaster that had come without warning, but one which, an investigation would reveal, could certainly have been avoided. The ICL Plastics factory was a 4-storey facility in Maryhill, Glasgow. The building was occupied by a number of different companies, all of them subsidiaries of the holding company ICL Plastics Limited. Stockline Plastics was one of these subsidiaries, with its main business being the distribution and supply of several different kinds of plastic. Other subsidiaries of ICL Plastics handled other parts of the business, such as marketing or manufacture. Because of its prominence, though, locals generally referred to the factory as the Stockline Plastics Factory. The main building was built in the 1860s and was originally used as a textile mill, then later as a paper mill. As its purpose changed over the years, it was expanded and modified. ICL Plastics first occupied the site in 1969 and made a number of significant changes. Gas tanks and pipes were installed to supply gas ovens used in the plastics manufacturing process. The roof was replaced, and throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the company purchased more buildings in the vicinity to expand their operations. In 1973, the yard in front of the building was raised in order to reduce the impact of flooding during rainy weather. Rubble infill and concrete were used to add an extra 1.1 meters or 3.6 feet to the yard, completely burying several gas pipes in the process. By the early 21st century, the building was typically occupied by between 60 and 100 members of staff on a daily basis, everyone from factory workers to company directors. At around midday on the 11th of May 2004, around 60 people were in the building when, without warning, a massive explosion took place. Gary Gentles, a manager at a nearby community centre, later gave this account of the blast. It was surreal. I was standing outside the halls on a nice hot summer's day, and all of a sudden there was a loud bang. I had never heard something so loud in my life. My first thought was a lorry had come off the road. Then I realised it was the plastics factory. I thought it must be a fire. It has to just be a fire. But then a couple of seconds later, everything went silent, and then I realised something serious had happened. The explosion had indeed been extremely serious. It had caused the majority of the Stockline Plastics factory to collapse instantly, with only one corner remaining intact. Passers-by immediately approached the wreckage and helped several workers extricate themselves from the uppermost layers of rubble. A patient transport ambulance that happened to be nearby was the first emergency vehicle to arrive on scene. Although the crew had limited resources to tackle a disaster of this type, they were able to begin triage and start coordinating the rescue operation. In doing so, they significantly expedited the response, potentially saving dozens of lives. Fire crews soon arrived on scene. It became clear that at least a dozen people were trapped under the rubble, and so efforts began to pinpoint their exact location. Thermal imaging equipment, fiber optic cameras, sniffer dogs, and carbon dioxide detectors, which could detect the byproducts of breathing, were used to try and locate the victims. Some of those trapped in the rubble were also able to shout for help or use their mobile phones to help rescuers locate them. On the first day, 7 people were pulled, alive, from the rubble. Around 300 firefighters and paramedics remained on site, supported by many other organisations, including the volunteer group International Rescue Corps, a group with prior experience of supporting rescue and recovery operations in the aftermath of earthquakes. Resources from across the country poured into Glasgow to help with the rescue effort. A sniffer dog team was sent from Lincolnshire, and a Sea King rescue helicopter from North Yorkshire was also made available. As survivors were discovered, they were transported to hospitals across Glasgow. Concerned relatives had begun to gather in the area, and the local Maryhill Community Central Halls were set up as a refuge for them, as well as a place to treat minor injuries on site. Local shops and businesses donated supplies to allow relatives to remain on site. Many families stayed at the community centre for the entire duration of the rescue operation. The search continued through the night and into a second day. It was an arduous process, with several firefighters treated for heat exhaustion after working long hours in hot and humid conditions, and in the presence of plastic fumes. After 4 days of intensive searching, the likelihood of finding any further survivors was considered minimal, and the operation was brought to an end. In total, 7 people had been declared dead at the scene, while a further 2 died from their injuries in hospital. 33 people had been injured, 15 seriously. As the rescue effort wound down, an investigation began. Initial reports suggested that gas ovens inside the factory were the cause of the explosion, while other accounts suggested that there hadn't been an explosion at all, and the building had just collapsed under the weight of heavy machinery stored on the uppermost floor. Neither of these theories, in the end, were correct. Authorities spent the 10 weeks after the explosion gathering evidence for their report. 120 police officers and health and safety executives were tasked with sifting the rubble. 1,000 bags of company paperwork were seized and examined, and over 1,000 witness statements were taken. This investigative process would eventually lead to the prosecution of ICL Plastics at a criminal trial, and a massive public inquiry. The public inquiry was held at the Maryhill Community Central Halls, where the relatives of those injured and killed in the blast had waited for news in the days following the disaster. So many wished to attend this inquiry that the Scottish Courts Service oversaw a complete renovation of the venue to ensure that it could accommodate them. Through these proceedings, the true cause of the blast was revealed. When the yard outside the factory had been razed in 1973, it had buried pipes that delivered liquid petroleum gas, or LPG, to the factory's gas ovens. The sections of piping which remained accessible had undergone routine inspections, but the buried sections had not. Over time, they had deteriorated, until a leak eventually formed, leading to a build-up of gas in a mostly unused basement area of the building. Risk assessments of the site should have considered the danger posed by buried pipes, but they did not. Because the pipes were not visible, and had not been accessible for several decades, it simply did not occur to inspectors to consider their condition, especially when there were numerous visible risks to occupy them. For example, during many visits, inspectors had prioritized ensuring the safety of the LPG storage tanks, forgetting in the process to also consider the pipework that led to and from them. A report on the disaster noted that, for everyone involved, hazards that were out of sight were out of mind. The source of the spark that had ignited the leaked gas was not definitively determined. A cigarette lighter found in the rubble suggested that it might have been caused by a worker lighting a cigarette, But equally, the gas could have been ignited by the activation of a non-spark protected light switch. ICL Plastics and another subsidiary company pled guilty to 4 health and safety breaches, and were each fined £200,000. Accepting this judgment, they issued a statement expressing their regret. While others may have played their part in the mistakes that led to the underground pipe being essentially ignored, both companies and the individuals responsible for overseeing the health and safety of the employees do not seek to escape responsibility for their own shortcomings. It has been said before, and should be said again, that both companies apologise and express deep remorse for those who have been affected by the tragedy. It was recommended by the public inquiry that all sites which used underground metallic pipework be identified and undertake work to replace the pipes. Additionally, it recommended that any industry which made use of liquid petroleum gas undergo extra safety inspections. The accident had been avoidable, and these measures aimed to ensure that it would not be repeated. In 2007, ICL Plastics set up a memorial garden to honour the 9 people that died as a result of the explosion. They were 49-year-old Margaret Brownlee, 32-year-old Annette Doyle, 52-year-old Peter Ferguson, 41-year-old Thomas Macaulay, 60-year-old James Stewart McCall, 27-year-old Tracy McErlane, 45-year-old Kenneth Murray, 31-year-old Timothy Smith, and 34-year-old Anne Trench. The garden sits today just a short distance away from the rebuilt Stockline Plastics factory, a reminder that even hazards which cannot be seen still have the power to kill.
Unethical human
finally
experimentation
difficult,
can
not
conjure
yet.
up the images of horror and pain inflicted by units.
Eek, well, that one isn't very YouTube appropriate. No, wrong one. No, we'll just do this. Alright, next one. Which one do I want to listen to? You know what? I'll listen to you. The Empress of Ireland short documentary, fascinating horror. There are other channels who get more in depth with this one. That's oh well.
On the 29th of May, 1914, 2 ocean liners collided in heavy fog in the St. Lawrence estuary on the east coast of Canada. The collision resulted in the loss of over 1,000 lives on the RMS Empress of Ireland, a death toll comparable to that of the sinking of the RMS Titanic 2 years earlier. The disaster was the 4th largest ever maritime loss of life in peacetime. The period from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s is often recognised as the golden age of sailing. Maritime technology advanced rapidly during this time, and there was a huge demand for the manufacture of new ships. Demand driven by increasing global trade, increasing immigration, and latterly by the advent of World War I. Commercial shipping companies rapidly expanded their fleets. Canadian Pacific Steamship was a major company providing passenger travel between the United Kingdom and Canada. They commissioned a ship to be built by the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company in the Scottish shipyards of Govan. This ship was to be known as the Empress of Ireland. Work started on the Empress in April 1905, and it was launched in January of the following year. The dimensions and power of the vessel were impressive. The ship was of steel construction and was 174 metres or 570 feet long. It had 4 large decks, which were divided into passenger cabins and spaces for entertainment. The whole thing was driven by a huge pair of twin propellers, which were turned by quadruple expansion steam engines. These gave the Empress a cruising speed of 18 knots, and an average transatlantic journey time of less than 4 days. Safety was also taken into consideration. The hull was divided into 11 compartments, which could be closed to water via a total of 24 watertight doors. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 also led to a worldwide revision of life-saving equipment, which prompted the Empress to switch from wooden lifeboats to sturdy steel ones. The ship had space for 1,542 passengers. First-class accommodation was available for 310 passengers and was located primarily on promenade decks adjacent to the dining room, library, and glass-domed music room, which came complete with its own grand piano. The lower promenade and main decks provided cabins for 468 in second class. Up to 764 cabins for third class and immigrant travellers were located in the forward portion of the ship. A primary function of the Empress of Ireland was to serve the Irish community who settled in Canada, and over its 8-year history, the Empress transported passengers between Liverpool, Ireland, and Canada. Canadian destinations would vary: Quebec City in late spring, summer, and autumn, then Halifax in Nova Scotia, and St. John in New Brunswick for winter and early spring. On the afternoon of the 28th of May 1914, the Empress of Ireland left eastbound for Liverpool on its last journey from port at Quebec City. The captain for this voyage was Henry George Kendall, a man who had just been promoted to take charge of her that month. There were 420 crew and 1,057 passengers on board. The numbers in first class were small on this particular voyage, and the bulk of second and third class consisted of a large party travelling to attend the 3rd International Salvation Army Congress in London, as well as some North American and Canadian former immigrants travelling to visit family and friends in Ireland and mainland Europe. The day after departure, the Empress of Ireland arrived at Pointe-au-Père. A specialist river pilot who had helped navigate the narrower parts of the St. Lawrence River disembarked, his job completed, and the ship resumed on an eastbound course. Even at midnight, visibility was good. Crew on board the Empress could easily see approaching hazards. Among these hazards was the Norwegian cargo ship the SS Storstad, which was approaching westbound. As long as visibility remained clear, the two ships would be in no danger of colliding. Before they could safely pass one another, however, a thick fog descended over the river mouth, drastically reducing visibility. Both ships started using fog whistles to advertise their location, but it was no good. Just before 2 o'clock in the morning, the Storstad loomed out of the fog and smashed into the Empress's starboard side. The damage to the Empress was catastrophic. A large puncture led to rapid flooding of the lower decks, where the majority of second and third class passengers were accommodated. With both ships still entangled, Captain Kendall anticipated that the Empress was likely to sink imminently unless something was done. The gaping hole had to be closed without delay. Kendall used a megaphone to call out to the Storstad to keep her engines running, and to keep driving forward so that she would plug the hole in the side of the Empress. Despite this, the momentum of the two vessels and the current of the St. Lawrence River combined and swiftly pulled the two ships apart. With nothing plugging the gaping hole in her side, it was now almost inevitable that the Empress would sink. Water gushed in through the breach so quickly that there was no opportunity to seal the watertight compartments. The ship leaned rapidly to starboard, allowing more water to enter portholes that had been left open for ventilation. Lower deck passengers and crew had no chance of escape, and were the first to lose their lives in the disaster. Those on the upper decks would ordinarily have had a better chance of escape via the lifeboats, but the angle of the Empress as it submerged was steep. Most lifeboats that were launched smashed against the ship's side, throwing their occupants overboard into the icy water. Within minutes, electrical power failed, and the sinking ship was plunged into darkness. As the Empress continued to lean to starboard, hundreds of passengers and crew climbed out onto the port side. This offered only a temporary reprieve. Within 15 minutes of the collision, the Empress upended and sank completely. The loss of life during the sinking was incredible. The loss of records makes the exact figure difficult to ascertain, but by most accounts, at least 1,014 people lost their lives when the Empress of Ireland sank. The Storstad spotted some survivors in the water, and a rescue operation was quickly arranged to pluck them out of the water using its own lifeboats. Two other ships, the Eureka and the Lady Evelyn, were alerted by the Pointe-au-Père Coast Guard, who had received a distress call. The Eureka arrived at the scene at 3:10 a.m, and the crew rescued around 150 people either from the water directly or from the few lifeboats that were successfully dispatched from the Empress. Survivors were taken to Rimouski Wharf for immediate medical care. By the time the Lady Evelyn arrived, no survivors could be seen in the water, but it assisted by transferring the 200 survivors collected by the Storstad and removing 133 bodies. Captain Kendall was among the survivors. He had been thrown into the water from the bridge as the Empress began to submerge, but was pulled onto a lifeboat by crew. He and his men proceeded to rescue as many passengers as they could, ferrying between the Empress and the Storstad until so much time had passed that, given the near freezing conditions, any further efforts would have been futile. Among the passengers who died were Lawrence Irving, the son of Victorian stage actor Sir Henry Irving, and his wife, the former member of the House of Commons Sir Henry Seton Carr, and Gabriel J. Marks, the Mayor of Suva. In second class, 167 members of the Salvation Army passed away during the disaster. An 11-day inquiry was held in Quebec, headed by Lord Mersey, who had previously contributed to the investigation into the sinking of the Titanic. Many lines of inquiry were followed. Had the crew and command been adequate? How had visibility changed as the fog descended? Had the fog whistles been used correctly to indicate the direction of each ship? And, importantly, were either Captain Kendall or the officers of the Norwegian ship responsible for the disaster? The inquiry established that lights and whistles were used appropriately, and that when the ships were clearly visible to each other, they were on course to pass safely, but that the Storstad made a last-minute directional change to starboard after the fog had descended, and therefore caused the collision. Following the inquiry, a court ordered owners of the Storstad to pay $2 million Canadian as compensation for silver bullion lost on the Empress of Ireland. Given the relatively shallow depth of water, salvage was considered possible, and the safe, valuables and mail from the Empress of Ireland, along with some human remains, were eventually retrieved by divers. This accident was one of the biggest disasters in the history of ocean liners, with a death toll of over 1,000. However, the disaster did not receive the same amount of media attention as the loss of the Titanic in 1912. The sinking of the Empress of Ireland did prompt some changes in ship design. The Storstad had featured a prow that was more prominent below the waterline, ensuring that in the event of a head-on collision, most damage would be done below the water. After the disaster, ships were designed with prows that were more prominent above the water, so that damage in the event of a collision would be concentrated there. To this day, the shipwreck of the Empress lies at the bottom of the St. Lawrence, marked by various monuments on dry land between Rimouski and Pointe-au-Père, maintained in memory of the thousands of lives that were ended when the Empress of Ireland sank beneath the water on the 29th of May, 1914.
Alright, what's next? This one looks interesting. The SS Noronic. Noronic.
On the 17th of September, 1949, a small fire began on board the passenger cruise ship, the SS Noronic. The ship was docked in Toronto Harbour at the time, and yet, despite its proximity to shore, the blaze would go on to become one of the deadliest in Toronto's history. It would be the end not just of a magnificent ship, but also of many innocent lives. The disaster would also mark the beginning of the end for the once massive Great Lakes passenger cruise industry. The SS Noronic was built in 1913 by the Western Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company at Port Arthur for the Northern Navigation Company, a business that would go on to become Canada Steamship Lines. The 110-metre, or 120-yard long ship could carry 600 passengers and 200 members of crew. It was nicknamed the Queen of the Great Lakes, and quickly became one of the most popular and well-regarded passenger cruise ships operating in that area. The SS Noronic deserved her reputation. As well as being the largest cruise ship to operate on the lakes, she was also the most luxurious. Designed to carry wealthy tourists, she was fitted with a library, music room, beauty salon, and an ornate ballroom, which housed a full orchestra. Walls and ceilings throughout the ship were beautifully decorated with hand-carved wooden panels made from oak, teak, and cherry wood. On the 14th of September 1949, the SS Noronic began a 7-day cruise of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. The ship was captained by 65-year-old William Taylor, who had nearly 4 decades of experience working with Canada Steamship Lines. Starting off in Detroit, the cruise ship made its way along the Detroit River to Lake Erie. After crossing the lake and docking in Cleveland, more passengers joined the ship for the second leg of the journey. At this point, a total of 574 passengers and 131 crew were on board. The first few days of the cruise went smoothly, until on the evening of the 16th of September, the SS Noronic docked at Pier 9 of Toronto's ferryport. Many of the passengers and crew on board disembarked and went to explore the city. The ship would be carrying on to Prescott the next day, and so they had only the one night to see what they wanted to see in Toronto. Few of those on board wanted to miss the opportunity. By midnight, however, most tourists had returned to the ship. Exact records of who was on board and who was still out in the city in the early hours of the 17th of September are not available, but most sources agree that several hundred passengers were back on board, along with only a small number of crew. By some estimates, there were only 16 crew members on duty overnight. At around 2:30 AM, Donald Church, a passenger who was making his way back from the smoking lounge, noticed smoke pluming from a linen cupboard. Alarmed, Mr. Church tried to open the door, but was unable to do so. He quickly summoned a member of the ship's crew. Bellboy Ernest O'Neill attended and witnessed the smoke, but did not alert his fellow crew members. Instead, O'Neill unlocked and opened the cupboard. Immediately, flames burst out and began to spread. Mr. Church and Mr. O'Neill fetched a nearby fire hose, but it malfunctioned and would not dispense any water. Realizing that the situation was out of control, the two men fled, Mr. Church running to inform his family, and Mr. O'Neill to tell the captain of the ship. At this stage, the ship's whistle was used to sound an alarm, but, much like the fire hose, at the crucial moment it did not work. Possibly because of damage caused by the heat of the fire, the whistle gave only a single brief shriek before falling silent. At this point, calls were placed to the Toronto Fire Department by people on the shore who could see smoke. The fire was spreading rapidly through the ship's narrow wooden corridors. By 2:38 AM, around half of the ship's decks were on fire. The SS Noronic had been decorated with vast amounts of wooden panelling that had been oiled and treated for decades, providing plenty of fuel for the fire. One witness described the ship as going up like a paint factory. The The flames were visible to firefighters as they approached the scene at 2:41 AM. Their size and intensity caused firefighters to call for extra resources while still en route to the site of the disaster. When firefighters did arrive, the scene confronting them was chaotic. The ship's only exits were on the lowest deck, and only 2 of its gangplanks were currently deployed. This left many passengers with no way of leaving the ship. Witnesses watched numerous passengers jump from the upper decks into the water of the harbour, or climb down ropes hanging from the side of the ship. Some passengers even smashed open the windows of their cabins and clambered out in order to escape. Firefighters quickly set up ladders to aid the evacuation. Many passengers were able to escape using these, so many that in one case, a ladder leading from an upper deck to a lower one broke under their weight. While firefighters rescued people from the ship, police and civilians were busy pulling passengers from the water. Donald Williamson, a civilian bystander who had been on his way back from a late shift at the factory where he worked, was one of the first on scene. He commandeered a nearby painter's raft, steered it towards the bow of the ship, and began pulling passengers out of the oily, freezing cold waters of the Toronto harbour. The pier was quickly filled with emergency vehicles and rescuers. When there weren't enough ambulances to carry all the injured to hospital, private taxis were used to ferry the most seriously injured to Toronto General Hospital and St Michael's Hospital. The walking wounded and those with minor injuries were directed to nearby hotels, where they were tended to by the Red Cross. Over 2 hours later, at around 5 AM, the fire had been extinguished, exposing the charred wreckage of the SS Noronic. By 10 AM, the rescue effort had become a recovery operation. Firefighters carried one body after another out of the ruin of the ship. Without knowing how many had been aboard when the fire began, an exact death toll could not be determined, but most estimates note that at least 118 people lost their lives. All of those who died on the day of the disaster were passengers, with only a single crew member later passing away from their injuries. An investigation into the causes of the disaster found that the ship's crew were insufficiently trained to respond to a fire, and that no reasonable plan was in place to evacuate passengers. No crew member had tried to summon the fire service during the disaster, and almost none had made any effort to wake sleeping passengers. One exception to this was Captain William Taylor, who was seen during the fire helping passengers from their cabins. He was reportedly one of the last to leave the burning ship. Despite this, it was determined that his lack of leadership had contributed to the high death toll, and he was suspended for a year. Taylor accepted this suspension, but retired before it was over and did not sail again. The inquiry also criticised the design and maintenance of the ship. In particular, the poor condition of the fire hoses, and the abundance of flammable material used to decorate the interior. It was decided that, in the future, passenger ships would need to be fitted with automatic alarms, sprinklers, and fire-resistant bulkheads. Crew would be required to carry out routine patrols, and would have to receive extra training in how to respond to a fire on board. To comply with these new standards, several older ships in service on the Great Lakes were retired early, and those that remained were subject to refurbishment and a rigorous inspection routine going forward. Despite its findings and recommendations for change, the inquiry was not able to determine the exact cause of the fire. Speculation that it had been arson became widespread. This idea, that the fire had been started intentionally, gained traction when, less than a year after the fire on the SS Noronic, the SS Quebec, another Canada Steamship Line's passenger ship, caught fire. In this case, the ship was safely evacuated, and it was determined that the fire had been started intentionally inside a linen cupboard. Nobody was ever charged with this arson, but the similarities to the fire on board the SS Noronic struck many as suspicious. It was, however, a mystery that would never be solved. Not long after these successive fires, the passenger trade on the Great Lakes came to an end. Many passengers expressed that it had not been the same since the loss of the Queen of the Great Lakes. For the region, and for the many people who worked and travelled on the lakes, the loss of the SS Noronic marked the end of an era.
Just had to pick bloody fascinating horror. It only does 10, between 9 to 11 minutes. And each hunt usually goes just about 15 or so minutes. Ugh, whatever. Alright, this one looks interesting. The Summer Street Bridge Disaster. Oop.
On the 7th of November 1916, the streets of Boston were crowded with people. The results of the 33rd United States presidential election were due to be announced, and tens of thousands of residents were waiting for news with bated breath. Before that news could arrive, however, another, more immediate event would demand their attention. Boston was about to witness the worst public transit disaster it had ever seen. In 1916, trolleys were a common means of transportation in Boston. These vehicles were fast and efficient, and could carry dozens of passengers in reasonable comfort. They ran on rails that crisscrossed the city, using power drawn from electrified lines suspended overhead. Though quite loud and rattly, they were a definite improvement on the horse-drawn vehicles which had been the norm for much of the previous century. Electrified trolleys were in common use in 1916, but radio and television were still in their infancy. When people wanted to know what was happening in the world, they turned to the newspapers. That's why, on the 7th of November, the streets of Boston were quite so busy. Workers trying to get home to their families were hampered by huge crowds, which formed outside newspaper offices, hoping to be among the first to hear any announcement. Things were so busy, in fact, that several extra cars had been added to the trolley system to help deal with the crowds. The 393 was one of these. It was added to the schedule at the last minute, due to follow a route through the industrial areas of South Boston, where hundreds of workers were waiting for a ride home. At the controls was motorman Gerald Walsh, assisted in his duties by conductor George McKeon. Neither man had worked this exact route before, but they were familiar with the neighbourhood, and it was standard practice for them to sometimes drive new routes to help cover for absent colleagues or fill gaps in the schedule. Despite the heat of the day and the crowds thronging the street, they set about their work as briskly as they could. Walsh drove the car at a rapid 24 kilometres or 15 miles per hour between each stop, taking on passengers at a rate almost faster than McKeon could ticket them. By the time the 363 started approaching the Fort Point Channel, it was very nearly full. There were seats for around 30 passengers inside the trolley, but it was now packed with more than twice that number, with riders standing on the back platform and filling the aisle too as the trolley rattled along towards the Summer Street Bridge. The Summer Street Bridge was a retractable bridge, something that would be a thoroughly unusual landmark today. Instead of lifting up like a drawbridge or swiveling to one side to let boats pass, the Summer Street Bridge was mounted on rails, which allowed the roadway to slide diagonally to one side when required. Indeed, this was exactly what was happening as the 363 approached. The bridge was partially open, waiting for a barge to pass through. Metal gates had been pulled across the road to stop traffic, although in the gathering dark they might have been difficult for motorman Walsh to see. In theory, they should have been illuminated by a red lantern, but there are conflicting reports about whether this lantern was put in place and whether it was working even if it was. One thing Walsh definitely didn't see was the stop sign located some way down the street from the bridge. This sign was supposed to make trolley drivers come to a complete halt, so that when they did approach the bridge, they would be doing so very slowly. Walsh, however, drove the trolley straight past the stop sign without even a moment's hesitation. Between the stop sign and the bridge, Walsh did slow down, but he did so only to allow an additional passenger to board. Once the man had safely climbed up onto the trolley, Walsh accelerated again, before suddenly slamming on the brakes as the open bridge came into view. The sight of the sheer drop in front of him must have been terrifying, because Walsh pumped the brake lever so hard that it bent in his grip. The wheels of the trolley locked, and it careened onwards, smashing through the gates. It reached the edge of the bridge, overran it, and teetered there for just a moment. As it lost contact with the electrical wires above, the power on board failed. The passengers were left in the dark, shaken and off balance, with the vast majority unable to see what was happening. One person who could see what was happening was passenger Christopher Thompson. He had been fare dodging, and, fearing that he was about to be caught, had jumped nimbly down from the back of the trolley as soon as he felt the brakes being applied. He landed in the roadway and turned around just in time to see the teetering trolley plunge down into the water below. While some of the passengers on the platform at the back of the trolley were able to leap clear as it fell, those inside were not so lucky. From the moment the trolley hit the water, the odds were stacked enormously against them. Many had already been knocked over or injured in the fall, and as water flooded in through broken windows, they found themselves in a blind and panicked scrum, with everyone packed into the car, lashing out blindly in all directions as they tried to escape. Miraculously, some did manage to make it out from inside the car. Arthur Smith, a fish salesman, was one of them. After being repeatedly kicked and slammed into by other passengers, he found himself next to a window. He used the back of his own head to smash it open and clambered through. On the way out, the sleeve of his coat became caught and he was dragged down the sinking trolley. Eventually, after a great struggle, he wriggled free, swam to the surface, and was hauled out by rescuers. Nelson McFarlane, an amateur boxer, was able to push one person clear of the trolley before it fell, but his act of heroism came at a cost. He himself went down into the water with the trolley. After getting clear and swimming to the surface, he rescued an elderly man who was struggling to stay afloat and towed him to safety. They were both pulled out of the channel, at which point McFarlane, despite serious injuries, started running back towards the water. Before he could do anything else, though, he collapsed from exhaustion and was taken to hospital. These survivors were among the lucky few. The vast majority of those on board simply didn't stand a chance. Rescuers were quick to the scene. Passers-by grabbed ropes from riverside factories, and a tugboat dragged several surviving passengers from the water. Even with the very best efforts of everyone present, though, there was little to be done. The crash had happened so quickly, and those who hadn't managed to exit the car within the first few moments of its sinking were beyond help. It would be a long time before the final death toll of the incident was known. Several bodies washed out of the car and were found some distance away. Others were recovered by divers one by one, in a painstaking process that lasted into the early morning hours of the next day. While most of the bodies were recovered that night, one victim of the accident wouldn't be found until their bodies surfaced in the channel the next year. Despite wildly varying numbers in the newspapers, the final death toll was 46, a loss of life greater than in any public transit accident in Boston before or since. In the aftermath of the disaster, motorman Walsh, who had survived the incident, was put on trial. He had failed to stop at the stop sign, a huge factor in the disaster. In his defence, however, it was argued that no red lantern had been on display on the gates, and that he hadn't known to look for a stop sign. Some similar bridges didn't have stop signs, or had them in different locations, or used completely different systems for managing traffic. The stop sign at the Summer Street Bridge was tiny, and mounted 2 stories up in the air. It was no wonder that a driver unfamiliar with the route had missed the sign. Walsh was ultimately found not guilty. Following the revelations during his trial, the signage at retractable bridges across the network was standardised. Now each and every one would use the same process to warn approaching traffic that the bridge was open. Even if a driver was unfamiliar with the route, they would know what signs to look for, where those signs would be, and what to do when they saw them. The trolley itself was lifted from the bed of the channel, refitted and put back into service. Passengers and drivers, however, were unwilling to set foot on board what they often referred to as the death car, and so it was put to work for maintenance purposes instead. The Summer Street Bridge is still in place today, although the mechanism which made it retractable has been removed. Buses still run over the bridge on a regular basis. There is nothing to mark the site of this disaster. Indeed, when compared with other tragedies that have taken place in Boston, the Summer Street Bridge disaster is all but forgotten. National papers at the time were dominated by the results of the election, and on a more local level, the disaster was surpassed in magnitude by the Coconut Grove fire several decades later. Though somewhat lost to history, the incident nonetheless touched many lives, and is a part of Boston's past that should not be entirely forgotten.
What's next? Maybe I should put on something longer. Like the Halifax explosion. And story of Jack. Maybe not that one. Not as interested in that one. This one is the Halifax explosion, a short documentary by, well, you know, fascinating horror.
Video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. On the 6th of December 1917, two ships collided in the mouth of Halifax Harbour in Nova Scotia, Canada.
When did I get that?
The collision sparked a fire on board one of the vessels, a repurposed tramp steamer packed with a cargo of explosives bound for the European theatre of war. At exactly 35 seconds after 9:04 am, this cargo detonated, bringing about one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever to take place. Halifax Harbour is a large, natural harbour on the Atlantic coast of Canada. It consists of a huge enclosed bay, known as the Bedford Basin, as well as a slender strait, known as the Narrows, which leads out towards open ocean, passing a few small islands on the way. On one side of Halifax Harbour, in 1917, was the town of Halifax. On the other side stood Dartmouth. Between them, the two towns had a combined population of around 65,000 people. This population had recently grown. The ongoing First World War made the harbour of great strategic importance. It was a key departure point for convoys of ships bound for Europe. It was an incredibly important port, and was thus busier during the war than it ever had been before. A few days before the disaster, the Norwegian ship, the SS Imo, arrived at Halifax Harbour and docked in the Bedford Basin, where it sat for several days awaiting supplies. Some of these, namely the ship's required load of coal, were delayed. Although cleared to leave on the 5th of December, the Imo didn't complete loading until too late in the day to depart. Submarine nets, designed to protect the ships at anchor in the Bedford Basin from attack by German U-boats, had been raised for the night, and therefore no ship could pass in or out. Although anxious to get underway, the crew of the Imo would have to wait until the next morning. Meanwhile, the French cargo ship, the SS Mont Blanc, was in a similar predicament outside the harbour. It had arrived too late in the day to be allowed to enter the Bedford Basin, and so was forced to wait outside the harbour until the submarine nets were lowered again the next morning. The crew of the Mont Blanc would no doubt have preferred to spend the night with the ship moored safely inside the harbour, especially considering the cargo it carried. On board was a staggering amount of explosive materials, including TNT, gun cotton, picric acid, and barrel upon barrel of tar-like benzol. Whatever fears the crew of the Mont Blanc might have had, the night passed uneventfully. At 7:30 AM on the morning of the 6th of December, the submarine nets were lowered and both ships started moving once more, the Emo heading out of Halifax harbour and the Mont Blanc heading inwards. Normally, ships passing through the Narrows were expected to stay on the right and to adhere to a speed limit of just 5 knots, about the pace of a swift jog. On this particular day, though, the captain of the Emo was so keen to get moving that he ignored the speed limit and surged into the Narrows at a much faster speed. At this point, the Emo encountered 2 other vessels, one after the other. First was the SS Clara, an American tramp steamer, coming into the harbour on the wrong side of the Narrows. The 2 boats signalled to one another, and the Emo ultimately moved towards the middle of the Narrows to avoid a collision. Moments later, the Emo encountered the tugboat Stella Maris, which was travelling down the centre of the strait. Again, the Emo moved aside, this time going from a position near the middle of the Narrows to completely the wrong side. That was how the Emo came to be on a collision course with the inbound Mont Blanc. The 2 ships sighted one another when they were still more than 1.2 kilometres, around 3/4 of a mile, apart, and began a series of frantic signals. The Mont Blanc had right of way, but the crew of the Emo, for whatever reason, indicated that they would not yield. When it became clear that the end result of this game of chicken would be a catastrophic collision, both ships cut their engines. The Mont Blanc tried to steer around the drifting Emo, and might have made it had the Emo not reversed its engines at exactly the wrong moment. The effect of this was to cause the nose of the Emo to swing into the hull of the Mont Blanc. The collision took place at a relatively low speed, and although quite damaging, did not immediately scuttle either boat. However, several barrels of the Mont Blanc's flammable cargo were ruptured in the smash, resulting in a huge spill of highly flammable material. Even at this point, though, a disaster was not yet assured. Without a spark, even the most explosive materials would not catch fire. For a moment, the boats drifted. Then, the Emo's engines kicked in once again, and the 2 damaged vessels parted ways. As they did so, metal scraped upon metal, sparks flew, and a fire began on board the Mont Blanc. Recognising the danger, the captain of the Mont Blanc, Amy Lemedic, ordered his crew to abandon ship. They needed no further encouragement to do so. Piling into lifeboats, they rowed for the shore, shouting desperate warnings to anyone they could see. Alas, such was the noise and confusion out on the water that very few people on nearby boats or watching from the shore actually heard or understood these warnings. The Mont Blanc itself drifted, blazing, towards the Halifax side of the Narrows, eventually beaching itself beside Pier 6 of the harbour. A huge plume of smoke rose into the air above it, and people on both sides of the water were drawn to their windows or to the waterfront in order to watch the drama unfold. At 9:04 AM and 35 seconds, the cargo on board the Mont Blanc detonated. The explosion was a huge one. The blast destroyed everything within 2.6 kilometres, or 1.6 miles, of the grounded ship. Beyond that, severe damage was done to thousands of buildings, and hot fragments of metal rained down across the city. A gun from the deck of the Mont Blanc was launched into the air and touched down again 5.6 kilometres, or 3.5 miles away. The shockwave travelled at many times the speed of sound and was felt across the whole of Nova Scotia. Buildings disintegrated, trees were flattened, cars tumbled, and ships lifted completely from the harbour and dumped onto land. In the space of a moment, around 1,600 people were instantly killed, and many more were seriously injured. Victims were buried beneath rubble, hit by flying debris, and, in many cases, received serious eye injuries as the windows they had been looking through exploded into shards of glass. As well as the destructive force of the blast, the explosion created a tsunami, a crashing 6-story wall of water that surged into the levelled city, crushing and drowning many of those who had survived the initial blast. The Emo was one of many ships swept up by this tsunami. As it was thrown from the harbour, almost everyone on board was killed. Worse yet, as the water receded, fires began to burn in the wreckage. The explosion had destroyed boilers, collapsed factories, and knocked over domestic stoves. Now the rubble caught fire, turning the rescue effort into a race against time. Time was not on the side of the rescuers. Since the explosion had taken place in the context of the First World War, the natural assumption of many was that it had been due to enemy action. Rather than immediately focusing on rescue, soldiers ran to their posts to defend against further attack. It was only after some hours had passed that the true source of the explosion was widely understood. Rescue work was grim and lengthy. Firefighters from across the province were joined by police and military, as well as hundreds of shell-shocked volunteers. They dug through the wreckage, pulling out any survivors they could find. These were sent to the city's remaining medical facilities. A deluge of thousands of seriously injured casualties arrived at every available hospital in a matter of hours. Several military vessels that had been close at the time of the explosion diverted to offer assistance, and were promptly converted into makeshift hospital ships. Although injured and shocked by what had happened, everyone present did whatever they could to help. There are even reports of children volunteering to carry messages across the town. This rescue effort was, however, soon complicated by worsening weather. The day after the explosion, when hundreds of people were still injured, homeless, and trapped beneath rubble, a blizzard descended on the city, bringing below freezing temperatures and 1.2 metres, or 4 feet, of snow. Not only did these horrendous conditions present a challenge for rescuers, but they also stopped relief from reaching the city. Trains carrying medical supplies and food were forced to stop in place in zero visibility, even though their supplies were desperately needed within the blast zone. The Halifax explosion, then, was a disaster of many dimensions. As such, the number of dead is difficult to estimate, but stands at around 2,000 in total, with a further 9,000 people suffering serious injury. As soon as the situation on the ground was under control, an inquiry was launched to establish who had been to blame for the incident. It might seem logical that the captain of the Emo was to blame for the disaster. After all, the Emo had been speeding through the Narrows just before the collision. It had been on the wrong side of the strait and had refused to yield even when signalled by the Mont Blanc. However, the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Arthur Drysdale, had little hesitation in blaming the crew of the Mont Blanc, who he alleged had failed to follow the rules concerning the movement of ships. There were likely several reasons behind this rather one-sided judgment, not least of which was a great deal of public anger. Given that the crew of the Emo had almost all been killed in the explosion, this anger was focused largely on the surviving crew of the Mont Blanc, who had, after all, abandoned ship in order to save their own lives when the fire began. 3 men were charged with manslaughter. They included Amy Lemedek, the captain of the Mont Blanc, Francis Mackey, a harbour pilot, and Frederick Evans Wyatt, the chief examining officer of Halifax Harbour. However, none of these men were ever brought to trial, as there simply wasn't enough evidence to do so. In any event, the ruling that the Mont Blanc alone had been at fault was overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1919, and it was established that both ships had made errors which contributed to the disaster. Despite the devastation of Halifax, some positive outcomes did arise from the disaster. The rules concerning harbour navigation and the storage of hazardous materials were changed to make a repeat of the explosion unlikely. Beyond this, the huge rescue efforts served to inform and bolster charitable organisations within Canada. The massive number of eye injuries caused by flying glass, for example, led directly to the founding of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind a few years later, while the extensive rescue effort underlined the importance of the Red Cross and helped them to grow into the humanitarian organisation they are today. In the aftermath of the disaster, there was a huge need for housing, and this led to the construction of one of the first public housing projects in Canada, known as the Hydrostone. Some of the dwellings constructed during this time are still in place today, providing a home to Halifax's modern citizens. One of the most enduring legacies from the disaster is one of civic friendship. Boston was one of the first cities to send aid to Halifax, and this aid arrived at a crucial time, just as the blizzard was setting in. The help provided by Boston was vital in saving lives and relieving medical staff and rescuers. As a thank you for this vital support at the most difficult time in its history, Nova Scotia donated a Christmas tree to the city of Boston. Many years later, this became a tradition, and to this day, Nova Scotia provides Boston with a tree. Though devastated by the explosion that rocked the harbour on the 6th of December 1917, Halifax has risen from the ruins. Today it is a thriving maritime city, home to more than 400,000 people. The Halifax explosion remains a painful but vital part of its history, and reminders of the suffering, the loss and the heroism of rescuers are everywhere. Though the city has recovered, the Halifax explosion will never be forgotten. There is one final and at least somewhat positive coda to the story of the Halifax explosion, that of Patrick Vincent Coleman. I'm able to include this story in this extra long episode thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. First and foremost, their support allows me to spend more time researching and writing, more time seeking out sources, and more time putting together a video that tells the full story of a massive historic disaster. But Surfshark itself also enables my research. I'm based in the UK, which means that all too often resources based in other countries are off limits to me due to GDPR-related blocks. With Surfshark, however, it takes only a few seconds and a couple of clicks to get around this. You might use Surfshark for research, or to stream documentaries that aren't normally available in your country, or simply to keep your location secret and your data secure. It really is quite simple to use, and unlike other VPNs, you can use it on an unlimited number of devices. If that interests you, go to surfshark.deals/fascinating and use the code FASCINATING to get 83% off a 2-year plan. Surfshark also has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can always change your mind if you don't find it as useful as I did. Again, that's surfshark.deals/fascinating, and use the code FASCINATING for a discount. Now here's the story of Patrick Vince Coleman, a man whose actions on the 6th of December 1917 saved an untold number of lives. Vince Coleman was a train dispatcher for Canadian Government Railways. On the day of the disaster, he was working at Richmond Station, not far from Pier 6, where the burning Mont Blanc ran aground. He would have had a clear view of the plumes of smoke rising from the burning vessel, and would no doubt have been deeply alarmed when a sailor dashed up to him and his colleagues to inform them that they must evacuate, as the burning boat was laden with explosives. Coleman and his colleagues, quite understandably, ran for their lives. Before getting very far, however, Coleman turned around and sprinted back to the telegraph office at Richmond Station. From there, he started sending out one final, desperate message. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbour. making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Coleman's message was most likely intended for one particular train, the overnight express from New Brunswick. This service, carrying around 300 passengers, was due to arrive within just a few minutes, and would have passed directly by the burning Mont Blanc when it did. Thanks to Coleman's actions, however, it was halted on the other side of the Bedford Basin, and 300 innocent people lived to see another day. Moreover, his message was relayed to many other stations, instantly halting inbound freight and passenger trains, and also alerting telegraph operators across Nova Scotia and beyond to the impending disaster. When the Mont Blanc exploded, the wheels were already in motion to begin delivering rescuers, supplies, equipment and aid to the victims of the disaster. Coleman, as he had predicted in his final message, did not survive. The explosion hit him with such force that it blew the hands from his pocket watch. Death would have been instant. His legacy, however, lives on, not just in the lives he saved, but in his presence as an enduring figure in history, a symbol of the many heroes who sacrificed themselves during the years of the First World War in order to preserve the lives of others. Today, Coleman's telegraph key and damaged pocket watch are preserved in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Nova Scotia. Though he has been dead for over 100 years, by virtue of actions taken in the final few seconds of his life, Vince Coleman stands to be remembered for centuries to come.
If you want, with most.
Okay, some time, a bit of a break.
This video is sponsored by Surf.
No, it's not. Alright, what's another... Ah, that's the one. Coconut Grove Disaster. Grove. There it is.
On the 28th of November, 1942, a hanging decoration in one room of the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston, Massachusetts, caught fire. The flames were, initially, quite trivial. Some of the patrons who witnessed them were even amused by the efforts of waiting staff to extinguish them using glasses of water and seltzer bottles. They could not possibly have known, at that moment, that this tiny flame would, within minutes, grow into one of the deadliest nightclub fires in American history. The Coconut Grove first opened in 1927 in the Bay Village area of Boston, where it was situated across the basement and ground floor of a converted warehouse complex. At the time, Prohibition was in full force, and so for the first few years, the venue operated as a speakeasy, selling alcoholic beverages even though alcohol was illegal. It was able to get away with this thanks to connections the owners had with the world of organised crime. From 1927 until 1933, the club had a somewhat unsavoury reputation. It was known as a favoured spot for gangs and mobsters. This changed in 1933, when two things happened. First and foremost, Prohibition ended, and the sale of alcohol became legal once again. Secondly, the then owner of the Grove was gunned down by a rival, and ownership of the property passed to his lawyer, a man named Barnett Wolanski. Under Wolanski's management, and without Prohibition to hold it back, the club flourished. It expanded into a warren of rooms across 2 stories, with multiple lounges, bars, dance floors and restaurants. Many of the rooms had a tropical theme, with extensive decoration including fake palm fronds and fabric wall hangings. There was also a famous rolling roof. In good weather, this could be cranked open to allow patrons to dance under the stars. Pleasant as it all might sound, Wolanski hadn't entirely steered the club away from its unsavoury origins. His connections with the mob, which he denied in public but often boasted about in private, allowed him to flagrantly ignore building codes and safety regulations. For example, Wolanski had several emergency exits hidden, locked or boarded up in order to prevent guests from leaving the venue without paying their bill. Nevertheless, the club soon became one of the most popular spots in Boston, with a constantly changing roster of live entertainment, and flocks of paying customers filling every room most nights. On the night of the disaster, the club was packed far beyond its listed capacity. In the Melody Lounge, which was situated in the basement, singer and pianist Goody Goodell was performing on a revolving stage. Patrons watched from booths and tables surrounded by fake palm fronds and lit by lamps nestled in coconut sconces. One couple, wanting a little more privacy, unscrewed the bulb in the sconce nearest to them, extinguishing it. This was witnessed by waiting staff, one of whom ordered a busboy to go and fix the lamp. The busboy did so, striking a match in the process to help him better see what he was doing. With a few quick twists, the lamp was fixed. The busboy extinguished the match, and everyone went about their business. Moments later, however, witnesses saw the first flames in the fake palm fronds which adorned the wall and ceiling around the sconce. Waiters rushed over and tried to extinguish the flames using water and seltzer, a sight that some found comedic at first. Soon, however, the incident stopped being funny at all. The fire spread from one palm frond to others, and then to the fabric-covered false ceiling. Waiters hauled decorations down from the walls in a last-ditch attempt to extinguish the fire, but in doing so opened up the space above the false ceiling, allowing the fire to spread more freely. The flames swelled, feeding on the hanging decorations and fabric wall and ceiling coverings. Sparks and burning scraps of material rained down on patrons, many of whom now recognized the seriousness of the situation. They were sitting in a crowded basement room, along with a rapidly growing fire. From this point onwards, the flames spread with astonishing speed. Patrons sprinted for the staircase from the Melody Lounge up to ground level. Some managed to escape with little more than burned hair. Others were not so lucky. A huge fireball overtook them, bursting out into the lobby of the Coconut Grove, pushing ahead of it a cloud of deadly fumes. The onset of the disaster was so rapid that some patrons didn't have time to move from their seats before they were dead. When their bodies were found, they were still seated, still with their drinks in hand. Even for those who did have time to react, their escape was hampered by a number of obstacles. Staff, who had not grasped the full severity of the fire, blocked exits, demanding people pay their checks before they leave. Some patrons tried to fetch their coats or other possessions before leaving, delaying their own exit and getting in the way of those who did want to flee. As the lights inside the club failed, chairs and tables were overturned, creating trip hazards for those now trying to find their way out in the dark. While all these things contributed to the death toll, the most serious problem was the lack of exits. As hundreds of patrons tried to flee, inward opening emergency exit doors soon became jammed with bodies, preventing anybody from escaping through them. Worse still was the main door of the club, a revolving door that became almost instantly clogged with those trying to escape. Many people stuck in this crush were, unfortunately, still alive when the fire reached them. Firefighters happened to be nearby at the time of the blaze, extinguishing an automobile fire. After spotting smoke over the Coconut Grove, they rushed to the scene and started attempting to rescue victims and control the flames. This was an astoundingly difficult task. Bodies were packed so tightly in the doorways that in many cases it was impossible to haul anyone free. Some firefighters sustained cuts and grazes as trapped patrons clawed at them, desperate to be rescued. Those who could be dragged clear were often so severely burned that the heat radiating from their bodies burned the hands of firefighters in turn. In addition to the heat, the rescuers had to contend with cold as well. The outside temperature fell drastically as the night set in, and very soon fire hoses were frozen to the ground, and survivors who had escaped the flames were at risk of hypothermia. Despite this multitude of adversity, there were survivors even amongst those who had been deep in the nightclub when the fire began. Staff fared better than patrons, as they knew the layout of the club and were often able to escape through windows and hatches rather than getting caught up in the crushes at the emergency exits. Several people also survived by hiding in a walk-in freezer, from which they were eventually rescued by firefighters. Hospitals in the area received an unprecedented influx of patients. More than 400 casualties were brought in for emergency treatment within just an hour or two. In a stroke of extreme good fortune, local hospitals were very well prepared for this sudden rush. With World War II looming on the horizon, hospitals had been stockpiling medical supplies and preparing for the worst-case scenario of an attack on the east coast of the USA. While these circumstances ensured that victims had excellent care and medical treatment, it was, in many cases, to no avail. Of the victims that were still alive when they reached hospital, more than half subsequently perished. Their injuries were too severe, and the medical technology available to treat burns and smoke inhalation in 1942 was too basic to save them. Ultimately, the Coconut Grove fire claimed the lives of 492 people. An investigation was launched. The exact cause of the fire was difficult to determine. Had it been the bulb the couple in the Melody Lounge had loosened in order to give themselves some privacy? Or had it been the match the busboy lit while trying to screw the bulb back in? No definitive answer was reached on this matter, but the busboy was identified by investigators. His name was Stanley Tomaszewski, and he was just 16 years old, too young to have been legally employed at the club. Many were quick to blame Stanley for the incident, but he was ultimately cleared of all charges. This was, first and foremost, because it could not be definitively determined whether the bulb or the match had been the source of ignition, but also because the initial source of ignition scarcely mattered. The interior of the club should have been fireproof enough that a hot bulb or dropped match could not start a deadly blaze. The real blame lay with the owner of the club. Barnett Wolanski had cut many corners during remodelling, flagrantly ignoring building codes and using unlicensed contractors. He had done so without fear of any consequences. His connections to organised crime ensured that his establishment would pass all safety inspections without a hitch. Indeed, the Grove had been inspected little more than a week before the fire, and declared safe, despite numerous highly visible safety violations. As well as locked and blocked emergency exits and exit doors that opened inwards rather than outwards, the report noted that some materials used to decorate the venue might have contributed to the fire. The decorative palm fronds, for example, were known to be flammable, and had in fact caught fire many times before, although on those occasions waiting staff had always been able to extinguish the flames before they spread. Worse still, some faux leather seats inside the Grove were found to be made of a material that was not only not fireproof, but which gave off a flammable gas when burned. While what had caused the fire remained up for debate, the conditions which allowed it to spread so terrifyingly quickly were obvious, and fell at the feet of the club's corrupt owner. Wolanski was tried and convicted of 19 counts of manslaughter. The number was set at 19 because it would have been impractical to try him for the deaths of all 492 victims. Thus, 19 were selected at random from the dead to represent the victims. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but pardoned by the governor of Massachusetts after just 4. In the end then, the man most responsible for the terrible loss of life at the Grove served less than 3 days for each victim. The long-term effects of the fire were wide-ranging. The treatment of burns victims was revolutionised by the incident. Different treatments were administered to the victims at different hospitals, and by comparing the results, it was possible to see which treatments were the most effective. The large number of victims provided statistical significance to the comparison, and allowed old and ineffective treatments to be thrown out in favour of more modern ones. 2 doctors who were working on the night of the Cocoanut Grove fire went on to invent a chart for measuring the severity and coverage of burns, a chart which is still in use to this day. Elsewhere, changes were made to building codes across the state of Massachusetts in the wake of the disaster. Many of these changes subsequently spread to other states, and even worldwide. It is in large part because of the Cocoanut Grove fire, for example, that in modern-day buildings, all revolving doors are flanked by normal, outward-opening doors, a change which might have made all the difference on November 28, 1942. The victims present then stood little chance of escape, and less chance still of recovery from their injuries, but the lessons learned in the aftermath of their death are many and varied, and give countless other potential victims a greater shot at survival, another chance at life.
Me for that, because I done all that I wanted. Maybe maniacs, and also got around to getting my first cat useful. That's the one that I really like. Use my kitty again. My starting cat, he was useless. Well, not useless, but you know, didn't have the skills and and moves that I would have liked it to have. But now it does. So I can use my starting cat and dog, which I'm very happy at, because I never liked that, we had to abandon our starting cat and dog, well, for a sparkling new better scout, and also, well, before Rise, how you had to keep on going, day in, day out, hunt after hunt, trying to get the good, one that has the correct moves and the correct skills, and so many times you'd get lucky enough to get all the moves right, but then you wouldn't have the skills right, and if you want a specific, build of skills, you had to keep on trying to roll the dice to get the good moves and the required skills. So I am so happy that I no longer need to worry about the bloody skills. I got my starting ones all buffed up now. All good and ready to go. I'm sentimental like that. Don't like abandoning my pets. So, what am I going to do next time I stream? Probably gonna take a nap and then make another stream. Whatever. Well, I suppose it'll be Hunter Rising again, then Hunter Betelgeuse. It's either that or, you know, do the Lunagaron and Zenoga or the Gormagal and Seragios. I mean, at least with these two, it's you fight just one of them. No, I'll stick with this. I'll stick with these two. Alright. So, that's me done for the day. Maybe. You do want to take a nap. 6 o'clock. It's usually when I have dinner anyway. Alright, end of the stream. I had fun listening to... where is he? Where is it? Fascinating Horror? Scroll the way up. Yeah, Fascinating Horror. So many of his videos, you know, between 9 minutes to 11 minutes. So... they do not last a hunt. So how about next time I do one of these grinding streams of trying to, you know, doing the quests and grind for materials, I choose a channel that does a little bit longer videos. As much as I like you know, as much as I like that channel, not good when you're also trying to, you know, do a stream and have to keep on doing the fascinating, you know, every time it switches onto another video, you have to copy the title and then the link to the video every 10 or so minutes, so but oh well. Next time, choose something better. Not better, but, you know, more appropriate. I mean, I was going to pick Summoning Soul, you know, with his basically hour-long documentaries of speed running, or one of the other various speed running channels that do little documentaries on them, but like bloody hour-long usually. But, you know, if it's not the horror movie, you know, these short documentaries, it's the long documentaries, and if it's not, you know, about tragedies, it's probably about speed running, or, you know, this or that. Well, to be really honest, when I'm not listening to one of those, I'm probably just watching / listening to another VTuber. Anywho, this is the end of the stream. And, as always, I say my goodbyes multiple times because I never know when the delay kicks in. So, goodbye, 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 goodbye.